I was standing in my garage loading up firewood when I noticed a line of snowmobiles tearing across my property, and that's when everything went sideways. These weren't friends or neighbors I recognized. They were strangers, at least a dozen of them, cutting fresh tracks through the carefully groomed cross-country ski trails I'd spent the entire previous weekend preparing on my 40-acre property in Eagle River, Wisconsin. My name is Samuel Zimmerman, and I'd moved here 2 years ago specifically to escape the chaos of Chicago and enjoy some peace in the Northwoods. I bought this land because it was perfect for winter sports, with rolling hills and dense pine forests that made for incredible skiing and snowshoeing. I dropped the firewood and walked out into the cold January air, my breath forming clouds as I tried to flag down one of the snowmobilers. The guy didn't even slow down. He just waved like we were old buddies and kept going. I felt my blood pressure rising as I watched them carve up the trails I'd spent hours on with my grooming equipment. This wasn't the first time I'd seen random people on my land this winter, but it was definitely the biggest group. I trudged back inside and called my neighbor, Mike, who'd lived in the area his whole life. "Hey, Mike, I've got a situation here. There's a bunch of snowmobilers all over my trails, and I have no idea who these people are or why they think they can just use my property." Mike was quiet for a moment. "Sam, you might want to check with the HOA. I heard something about winter recreation access, but I'm not in your association, so I didn't pay much attention." "What do you mean, winter recreation access? This is my private property." "Just call them. Trust me on this one." I hung up feeling uneasy. The Pine Valley Homeowners Association had been mostly quiet since I moved in. I paid my dues, followed the rules about exterior paint colors and lawn maintenance, and generally stayed out of their way. I'd been to maybe 2 meetings total, both of which were mind-numbingly boring discussions about landscaping requirements and mailbox designs. I found the HOA contact information and dialed the number for Margaret Hendricks, the association president. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered with a clipped, professional tone that immediately set me on edge. "Pine Valley HOA, Margaret speaking." "Hi, Margaret. This is Samuel Zimmerman from 4892 Pinecrest Trail. I'm calling because there are people using my property without permission, specifically my winter trails, and I was told to contact the HOA about it." "Oh yes, Mr. Zimmerman. The Winter Trails Program. We sent out information about that in November." "What Winter Trails Program?" "I never got any information about this." I heard papers shuffling on our end. "According to our records, notification was sent to all homeowners on November 15th. The program allows community members and visitors to access designated winter trails throughout the association for a small fee." My hand tightened on the phone. "Margaret, those trails are on my private property. I made them myself. I own that land. Mr. Zimmerman, when you purchased your property, you agreed to the HOA covenants and bylaws." Section 12, subsection 4 addresses community recreational amenities and shared seasonal access rights. I read those bylaws. There was nothing in there about letting strangers onto my land. The bylaws were amended at the annual meeting in October. You were notified by mail. I felt heat rising up my neck. I was out of town for work in October, and even if the bylaws were amended, you can't just decide my private trails are community property. Margaret's voice took on a condescending edge that made my jaw clench. "Mr. Zimmerman, this is for the good of the community. The Winter Trails program brings in revenue that helps offset association costs. Everyone benefits. Everyone except me, apparently. How much revenue are we talking about? That's association business, Mr. Zimmerman. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." "Wait, Margaret, I want this stopped immediately. Those people need to stay off my property. You can bring your concerns to the next HOA meeting on February 3rd. Good day." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding the phone, absolutely stunned. I'd just been told that the HOA was charging people to use trails on my private property, and somehow this was supposed to be legal because of some bylaw amendment I'd never agreed to. I spent the next hour researching Wisconsin property law and HOA regulations online. From what I could find, homeowners associations did have significant power, but they couldn't just claim private property for community use without proper legal procedures, and almost certainly not without compensation to the property owner. This whole situation smelled wrong. The next morning, I drove down to the association office, a small building near the entrance of our development. Margaret was there along with another woman I didn't recognize, both of them looking at a computer screen. They glanced up when I walked in, and Margaret's expression immediately soured. "Mr. Zimmerman, I wasn't expecting you. We need to talk about this trails situation, Margaret. What you're doing is illegal." The other woman stood up. She was probably in her mid-40s with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the kind of pinched expression that suggested she spent most of her time finding fault with everything around her. "I'm Brenda Kowalski, the HOA Vice President and Compliance Director." "Mr. Zimmerman, threatening legal action against the association is a violation of community harmony standards." I couldn't help but laugh. "Community harmony standards. You're charging people to trespass on my land and you're talking about harmony." Margaret folded her arms. "As I explained yesterday, this is entirely within the association's rights. The Winter Trails program was properly voted on and approved." "By who?" "I never got to vote on it. Homeowners who attend the meetings get to vote. That's how democracy works, Mr. Zimmerman." "That's not democracy. That's a rigged system. You can't vote away my property rights because I missed a meeting." Brenda stepped forward, getting uncomfortably close. "Your property is part of this community. That comes with responsibilities and shared resources. We've designated your trails, along with several other parcels, as part of the Winter Recreation Network. We're charging $15 per day per person, or $50 for a season pass. The revenue goes into the association's general fund." My mind was reeling with the implications. "How many people have bought passes?" "That's confidential association business," Margaret said. "Like hell it is. If you're making money off my property, I have a right to know how much." The two women exchanged glances. "Finally," Margaret said, "we've sold approximately 200 season passes and we average about 30 daily passes per week. But again, this revenue benefits everyone in the community through reduced dues and improved common areas." I did the quick math in my head. 200 season passes at $50 each was $10,000. 30 daily passes per week at $15, over roughly 12 weeks of winter season, was another $5,000 or so. They were making around $15,000 by letting strangers use my property, my equipment, my time and effort, and they thought this was acceptable. "I want this program shut down immediately, or I'll be filing a lawsuit against the association by the end of the week." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Zimmerman, litigation against the HOA is also a violation of your covenants. We can fine you up to $500 per day for frivolous legal actions." Let me get this straight. You're stealing my property, profiting from it, and threatening to fine me if I try to stop you legally. "We're not stealing anything," Margaret said firmly. "We're managing community resources as outlined in the governing documents you agreed to when you purchased your home." I left the office before I said something I'd regret. Back home, I immediately started calling lawyers. The first three I reached either didn't handle HOA disputes or were already representing other parties in the association. The fourth, a guy named Tom Richardson in Rhinelander, agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Tom's office was above a hardware store, a modest setup that didn't inspire tremendous confidence. But when I laid out the situation, his eyes lit up. "Sam, this is one of the most blatant HOA overreaches I've seen in 15 years of practice. They can't just appropriate private property for commercial use. That's not how any of this works. So what do? First, we send them a cease and desist letter. Then we file for an injunction to immediately stop the program. After that, we explore damages for the revenue they've already collected. This could also be theft, potentially conversion of property rights. Depending on how we want to play it, we might even involve law enforcement." That last part caught my attention. You think what they're doing is criminal, potentially. They're operating a commercial enterprise on property they don't own without the owner's consent and pocketing the money. That's not just a civil matter. But let's start with the legal route and see how they respond. Tom drafted a cease and desist letter that afternoon. It was 5 pages of legal language that basically said stop immediately or face serious consequences. We sent it by certified mail and email to ensure they couldn't claim they never received it. The response came 2 days later, but not from Margaret or Brenda. Instead, I got a letter from someone named Patricia Chambers, who identified herself as the HOA's attorney. The letter was dismissive and condescending, essentially arguing that the association's bylaws were legally binding and that I had no grounds for complaint. It also included a thinly veiled threat about countersuing for harassment and legal fees if I continued to attack the association's legitimate community programs. Tom read the letter and shook his head. "They're doubling down. Okay, we file the injunction. I'll have it ready by tomorrow." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the work I'd put into those trails. I'd bought a snow grooming attachment for my ATV specifically to maintain them. I'd spent weekends clearing brush, marking paths, and creating a network that was perfect for Nordic skiing. It was one of my favorite things about living here, and now it had been turned into a profit center for a power-hungry HOA board. The next day was Saturday, and I decided to go out and see the situation firsthand. I dressed warmly, grabbed my camera, and headed to the main trailhead on my property. What I found made my blood boil all over again. Someone had installed an official-looking sign that read, "Pine Valley Winter Trails Network fees required passes available at HOA office." Below that was a rate schedule and rules, including things like stay on marked trails and no alcohol. These were my trails on my land, and they'd turned it into some kind of official park. I took photos of everything. Then I noticed something else. There was a small wooden collection box attached to a post, the kind you'd see at a self-service parking lot. It had a slot for money and a stack of envelopes with Pine Valley Winter Trails Daily Pass printed on them. I couldn't believe the audacity. As I was photographing the collection box, I heard voices. A group of 4 people came around the bend on cross-country skis. They saw me, and one of them, a woman probably in her 30s, called out cheerfully. "Beautiful day for it, isn't it?" I forced a smile. "It is. Hey, can I ask how you folks heard about these trails?" "Oh, we saw the flyers at the visitor center in town. It said there was this great trail network with groomed paths. We bought season passes. Best $50 I've spent this winter." Another person in the group added, "Yeah, whoever maintains these does an amazing job. Really professional setup." I thanked them and let them continue. They had no idea they were skiing on private property, or that the person who'd done all that maintenance work wasn't seeing a dime of their money. These were just people looking for winter recreation. The real problem was the HOA, taking advantage of my labor and property. I headed back to my house and nearly walked right into Margaret Hendricks standing in my driveway. She was talking to another woman, someone I'd seen at one of the HOA meetings before. When Margaret saw me, her expression hardened. "Mr. Zimmerman, I came to discuss this situation before it gets out of hand." "Before it gets out of hand, Margaret, it's already out of hand. You're running a business on my property." The other woman spoke up. "I'm Karen Whitmore, HOA treasurer." "Mr. Zimmerman, we're trying to work with you here. The association is willing to offer you a compromise." I crossed my arms. "I'm listening." Karen pulled out a folder. "We'll reduce your annual HOA dues by $500 in exchange for your cooperation with the Winter Trails program." That's a substantial savings. My dues are $800 a year. You're making $15,000 off my property and you're offering me $500. Margaret jumped in. "The expenses of managing the program are considerable, Mr. Zimmerman. Insurance, marketing, signage, administrative costs. The net revenue is much less than you think." "Then show me the books. Show me exactly where all this money is going." "Association finances are reviewed by the board and reported to members at the annual meeting. We're not required to provide individual accounting to every homeowner who asks." I could feel the conversation going nowhere. "Here's my compromise. Shut down the program, remove all your signs and equipment from my property, and we'll call it even. Otherwise, you'll be hearing from my lawyer." Karen's friendly demeanor vanished. "Mr. Zimmerman, if you force the association to spend money on legal fees defending against a baseless lawsuit, those costs will be passed on to all homeowners through special assessments. You'll be making yourself very unpopular in this community." "That sounds like a threat." "It's a fact," Margaret said coldly. "Your stubbornness affects everyone here, but if you want to be that person, that's your choice." They left and I immediately called Tom to update him. He wasn't surprised. "They're trying to intimidate you. It won't work. The injunction will be filed Monday morning. In the meantime, you have every right to post no trespassing signs on your property." I spent the rest of that Saturday putting up signs. Big, bright orange, "No trespassing private property" signs every 50 feet along the trails. I also put up a large notice at the main trailhead explaining that this was private property, and the HOA had no authority to charge for access. Sunday morning, I woke up to find my no trespassing signs had been removed. Every single one of them. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report. The deputy who came out, a young guy named Officer Reynolds, took notes but seemed skeptical about the whole situation. "So the HOA took down your signs. They're the only ones who would benefit from removing them. Did you see anyone remove them?" "No, but it happened overnight." Officer Reynolds tapped his pen against his notepad. "Mr. Zimmerman, without evidence of who removed the signs, there's not much we can do. This sounds like a civil dispute between you and your homeowners association. Those usually don't involve law enforcement." "Officer, they're making money by bringing people onto my property without permission. That's trespassing and they're facilitating it. The people using the trails think they have permission because they bought passes from the HOA. That makes it a civil matter, not criminal. My advice would be to work it out with your association or hire a lawyer." He left, and I felt more frustrated than ever. The legal system was supposed to protect property rights, but I was getting stonewalled at every turn. Monday came, and Tom filed the injunction. The court date was set for 2 weeks out, which felt like an eternity. In the meantime, people kept using my trails. Every day I'd see groups of skiers, snowshoers, and occasionally snowmobiles. I tried talking to some of them, explaining the situation, but most just looked confused or annoyed. A few said they'd ask for refunds from the HOA, but most shrugged it off. They'd already paid. They figured they might as well use the trails. The harassment started 3 days after I filed the injunction. It began with letters from the HOA citing me for various violations. My garbage cans were visible from the street, which violated aesthetic guidelines. My driveway had ice melt stains, which violated maintenance standards. My exterior light fixtures were not on an approved list, even though they'd been there when I bought the house. Each violation came with a $50 fine. Then my mailbox got knocked over. The HOA sent me a violation notice for having a damaged mailbox. When I replaced it, they sent another notice saying the new mailbox wasn't on the approved vendor list, and I'd have to replace it again or face additional fines. I documented everything and sent it all to Tom. "They're retaliating," he said. "This strengthens our case. Keep records of every interaction, every fine, every incident." The court date finally arrived. We met at the county courthouse in Eagle River on a cold February morning. Margaret, Brenda, and Karen were there with Patricia Chambers, their lawyer. Patricia was an older woman, probably in her 60s, with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen and heard everything. Judge Lawrence presided. He was a no-nonsense type who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Tom presented our case clearly and methodically. He showed evidence of the signs the HOA had installed, the collection boxes, the promotional materials advertising the trails, and the cease and desist letter we'd sent. He emphasized that this was private property being used for commercial purposes without the owner's consent. Patricia countered by arguing that the HOA bylaws, which I'd agreed to when purchasing the property, gave the association broad authority over community amenities and recreational areas. She cited the specific bylaw amendment and provided minutes from the October meeting where it had been voted on. "Your Honor," Patricia said, "Mr. Zimmerman had every opportunity to participate in the democratic process of his homeowners association. He chose not to attend meetings and now objects to decisions made by his neighbors. That's not grounds for judicial intervention." Tom stood up. "Your Honor, no HOA bylaw can override fundamental property rights. The association cannot simply declare private property to be a community amenity. If that logic held, an HOA could vote to use anyone's backyard for community barbecues or decide someone's garage should be shared storage. The law doesn't work that way." Judge Lawrence asked to see the original bylaws and the amendment. He spent several minutes reading through them while we all waited in uncomfortable silence. Finally, he looked up. "Miss Chambers, I'm struggling to find anything in these bylaws that specifically authorizes the association to use private property for fee-based recreational programs." Section 12, subsection 4 talks about maintenance of common areas and shared amenities, but Mr. Zimmerman's 40 acres are not designated as a common area. Patricia didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, the bylaw amendment specifically addresses seasonal recreational access. It was properly voted on and approved. That creates a legitimate community easement. An easement requires compensation to the property owner. What compensation has Mr. Zimmerman received?" The association offered to reduce his annual dues by $500. "Did Mr. Zimmerman accept that offer?" "No, Your Honor." "So there's no agreement, no easement, and no compensation. Miss Chambers, this looks like conversion of property for commercial use without consent. I'm inclined to grant the injunction." I felt a surge of relief, but Patricia wasn't done. "Your Honor, if you grant this injunction, you'll be disrupting a program that hundreds of community members and visitors rely on. The economic impact on local businesses and the association itself would be substantial. We request time to negotiate a settlement with Mr. Zimmerman. Tom shook his head. Your Honor, they've had weeks to negotiate. Instead, they've retaliated against my client with frivolous violation notices and harassment. There's no good faith on the other side. Judge Lawrence leaned back in his chair. Here's what's going to happen. I'm granting a temporary injunction effective immediately. The HOA will cease operations of the Winter Trails program on Mr. Zimmerman's property within 48 hours. All signs, collection boxes, and other materials must be removed. The HOA is prohibited from advertising or promoting access to Mr. Zimmerman's property. I'll schedule a full hearing for next month to address the underlying issues and potential damages. Both parties are encouraged to reach a settlement, but if not, we'll have a trial. Is that clear? Both lawyers acknowledged they understood. We left the courthouse, and I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. That's a good ruling, Sam. They have to stop now, or they'll be in contempt of court. What about all the money they already made? That's what the damages hearing is for. We'll argue that you're entitled to all the revenue generated from your property, plus compensation for your time and effort maintaining the trails. Could be substantial. That afternoon, I went out to check the trails. The signs were still up, and I saw several people using the paths. I called Tom, who said it would take time for the HOA to comply. The 48-hour window hadn't started until they were officially notified, which would happen that day. By Wednesday evening, the signs were still there. I took photos and sent them to Tom. He filed a contempt motion Thursday morning. That got their attention. By Thursday afternoon, Margaret and Brenda were out there personally removing every sign, every collection box, and every piece of HOA-installed equipment. I watched from a distance, making sure they didn't damage anything. Margaret saw me watching and walked over. Her face was red, either from cold or anger, probably both. Are you happy now, Mr. Zimmerman? You've ruined something good for this entire community because of your selfishness. Margaret, you stole from me. You made thousands of dollars off my work, my land, my equipment. Don't try to make me the villain here. We were trying to create something positive, a community amenity that everyone could enjoy, but you couldn't see past your own property line. If you wanted to create a trail network, you should have done it on HOA common land or negotiated with me fairly. Instead, you just took what you wanted and acted like I should be grateful. She turned and walked away without another word. Brenda shot me a look of pure contempt as they loaded their truck with the removed signs and drove off. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I expected more retaliation, but nothing came. Tom said they were probably regrouping and talking to their lawyer about strategy for the damages hearing. Then I got a call from Karen Whitmore, the HOA treasurer. Her tone was conciliatory, almost friendly. Mr. Zimmerman, I wanted to reach out personally. Some of us on the board feel this situation got out of hand. We'd like to discuss a reasonable settlement. I'm listening. The association is prepared to pay you $5,000 in exchange for dropping the lawsuit and agreeing to limited trail access through the end of the winter season. After that, we'll negotiate something more formal for next year if you're interested. $5,000 was a third of what they'd made. Karen, you made $15,000 off my property. $5,000 doesn't even cover that, let alone compensation for my work or damages for the harassment. Mr. Zimmerman, $5,000 is our best offer. The alternative is we go to court, spend thousands on legal fees, and nobody wins except the lawyers. Put together a settlement offer for $15,000 plus an agreement to drop all the bogus violation fines, and we can talk. Otherwise, I'll see you in court." She hung up and I called Tom to update him. He thought 15,000 was reasonable, maybe even conservative. We could probably argue for more, especially with the harassment and the contempt issue. But if they agree to 15, it's a clean resolution. A week passed with no response. Then I got a call from someone named Douglas Fenton. He identified himself as a board member I hadn't met before. "Mr. Zimmerman, I'm calling on behalf of a group of homeowners who are very concerned about the direction this dispute has taken. We didn't know about the Trails program until recently, and we don't support what Margaret and her group did. Okay, we're organizing to recall the current board. Several of us are running for positions in the emergency election. If we win, we'll settle this immediately and make sure something like this never happens again. But we need your help." "What kind of help?" "We need you to come to the homeowners meeting next Tuesday and explain what happened. A lot of people have only heard Margaret's side, which is that you're a selfish neighbor who's ruining a community program. They need to hear the truth." I agreed to attend. The meeting was at the community center, a larger venue than the usual HOA office. When I arrived, the parking lot was packed. Apparently, word had gotten out and people were curious. Inside, maybe 100 people were seated in folding chairs. Margaret was at a table up front with Brenda and Karen. Douglas Fenton saw me come in and waved me over to a seat he'd saved near the front. Margaret called the meeting to order. She started with routine business, approving minutes from previous meetings and discussing snow removal contracts. Then she got to the main event. Many of you have heard about the legal dispute with Mr. Zimmerman concerning the Winter Trails program. I want to address this directly. The board worked hard to create a recreational amenity that would benefit our community and bring in revenue to offset rising costs. Mr. Zimmerman has chosen to prioritize his personal interests over the good of the community. And as a result, the program has been shut down by court order. This is unfortunate and we're exploring our legal options going forward. Douglas stood up. "Margaret, that's not the whole story and you know it. Mr. Zimmerman, would you like to explain what actually happened?" I stood up, feeling dozens of eyes on me. "Thanks, Douglas. Here's what happened. The HOA started running a commercial operation on my private property without my knowledge or consent. They put up signs, installed collection boxes, and charged people to use trails that I built and maintained myself. They made around $15,000 doing this. When I found out and asked them to stop, they refused and said it was legal because of a bylaw amendment passed at a meeting I didn't attend. They offered me $500, a fraction of what they made, and when I hired a lawyer, they retaliated with bogus violation notices. A judge agreed with me and shut the program down. That's the real story." The room erupted in conversation. Some people were clearly sympathetic to me. Others looked angry, presumably at the board. A woman near the back stood up. "Margaret, is this true? Did you really make $15,000 off this man's property?" Margaret's face flushed. "The program generated revenue that benefited everyone through improved common areas and services. Mr. Zimmerman was offered compensation." $500, I said loudly. "They offered me 500 out of 15,000. A man in his 50s stood up. "I'm Robert Chen. I've been in this community for 12 years. Margaret, this is outrageous. You can't just take someone's property and profit from it. That's not what an HOA is supposed to do." Brenda jumped in, her voice sharp. "Mr. Zimmerman agreed to abide by our bylaws when he bought his house. He can't just ignore the rules when they don't suit him." Tom had helped me prepare for this. "The bylaws don't authorize what you did, Brenda. A judge already ruled on that. And even if they did, you can't override state property law with HOA bylaws. That's not how any of this works. Douglas took control of the meeting. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in the current board. According to our bylaws, if 25% of homeowners present vote for recall, we have to hold an emergency election within 30 days. The vote wasn't even close. About 70 people voted for recall, which was well over the threshold. Margaret tried to object, arguing about procedures and notice requirements, but Douglas had done his homework. Everything was by the book. The meeting ended with an election scheduled for 3 weeks out. Margaret, Brenda, and Karen left quickly, refusing to talk to anyone. I stayed and talked to several homeowners who had questions or wanted to express their support. A few people apologized for using my trails, saying they'd had no idea about the situation. Douglas pulled me aside. "Sam, this is going to get messy before it gets better. Margaret and her allies won't go down without a fight. Are you prepared for that? I've dealt with worse, but I appreciate the warning." The next 3 weeks were intense. Margaret's faction put up campaign signs and sent out mailers attacking Douglas and his slate of candidates. They accused the reform group of trying to destroy the community and painted me as an outside agitator. They even sent out financial projections showing how dues would have to increase without the trail's revenue. Douglas and his team fought back with facts. They got access to the HOA financial records and found some disturbing patterns. The trail's program revenue hadn't gone entirely into the general fund like Margaret claimed. Thousands of dollars had been spent on consulting fees paid to a company owned by Brenda's husband. Other expenses were vague or poorly documented. Tom looked at the financial records Douglas shared with me and whistled. "Sam, this might be bigger than we thought. If they misappropriated HOA funds, that's embezzlement. You need to take this to the authorities." I met with Douglas and showed him what Tom had found. Douglas was angry but not surprised. Margaret has run this HOA like her personal kingdom for 5 years. I always suspected something wasn't right with the finances, but I could never get access to detailed records until now. We compiled everything and took it to the Vilas County Sheriff's Office. This time, we met with Detective Sarah Morrison, who specialized in financial crimes. She listened carefully as we laid out the evidence. "So you're alleging that the HOA board members embezzled funds through fake consulting contracts and misappropriated revenue from an unauthorized commercial operation on private property?" "That's exactly what we're alleging," I said. Detective Morrison took copies of all our documents. "I'll need to investigate this. It'll take time. In the meantime, don't discuss this with anyone outside this room. If there's something here, we don't want to tip them off." The election happened before the investigation got far. Douglas and his reform slate won decisively. Margaret got less than 20% of the vote. The new board was sworn in immediately, and their first action was to suspend Margaret, Brenda, and Karen from any HOA activities pending a full financial audit. Tom and I negotiated a settlement with the new board. They agreed to pay me $20,000, which included the trail revenue plus compensation for my work and damages for the harassment. They also formally apologized and committed to transparency reforms, but the criminal investigation was still ongoing. Detective Morrison subpoenaed bank records and conducted interviews. In late March, just as the snow was melting and winter was giving way to spring, the arrests happened. I was working in my garage when I saw sheriff's vehicles drive past toward Margaret's house. Tom called me 20 minutes later. "Turn on the news. Margaret, Brenda, and Karen just got arrested." The local news showed all 3 women being led out in handcuffs. The charges were embezzlement, theft, and fraud. According to the news report, they'd stolen over $50,000 from the HOA over 3 years through various schemes. The Trails program was just the most recent example of their willingness to abuse their authority for personal gain. The trial happened in September. I had to testify about the Trails situation and the retaliation I'd experienced. The prosecution laid out a detailed case showing how the 3 women had systematically looted the HOA's finances. The consulting fees to Brenda's husband's company, inflated landscaping contracts from Karen's brother, credit card charges for personal expenses that Margaret had hidden in the budget. The jury convicted all 3 on multiple counts. Margaret got 4 years in prison. Brenda got 3 years. Karen got 2 years in probation because she cooperated with prosecutors and testified about how Margaret had orchestrated everything. By the time sentencing happened, life in Pine Valley had returned to normal. The new HOA board was transparent and reasonable. They focused on actual community needs like road maintenance and common area upkeep. They even asked if I'd be willing to let some neighbors use my trails informally, with no fees or official program. I agreed, as long as people asked permission and respected the property. I rebuilt my trails that next winter. A few neighbors helped, and we created an even better network than before. No signs, no fees, just people enjoying the outdoors on beautiful winter days. Sometimes I'd see families skiing together or solo adventurers exploring the paths. It felt good to share something I'd created, but on my terms. One Saturday morning in January, almost exactly a year after this all started, I was out grooming the trails when a couple I didn't recognize skied up. They were probably in their 30s, dressed in high-end winter gear. "Excuse me, are you Samuel Zimmerman?" "I am." The woman smiled. "We heard about what happened last year. We're thinking about buying a house in Pine Valley, but we wanted to talk to you first. How is the HOA now? Is it safe to move here?" I thought about everything that had happened. The anger, the stress, the legal battles, the eventual vindication. The HOA is much better now. The new board is transparent and follows the rules. But here's my advice. Stay involved. Go to the meetings. Read the bylaws. Ask questions. Most HOA problems happen because people assume everything is being handled properly. Don't make that assumption. The man nodded. "That's good advice. Thanks. And thanks for these trails. They're beautiful." I watched them ski away, then continued grooming. The sun was bright, the snow was perfect, and I was finally at peace with my place in this community. It hadn't been easy, but standing up for what was right had been worth it. Later that day, Douglas stopped by. He'd become a good friend through all this. "Sam, you've got a minute?" "Sure, come on in." We sat in my living room with coffee. Douglas looked uncomfortable, which wasn't like him. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. You know how we've been rebuilding the HOA's reputation and finances?" "Yeah." "Well, we've got enough money now to actually create a real community trail system on HOA land. We're buying a 20-acre parcel adjacent to the development. We want to develop it for winter recreation, and we'd like your help designing and maintaining the trails. We'll pay you fairly for the work." I couldn't help but smile. That's exactly what Margaret should have done in the first place. "Exactly. So what do you think? Are you interested?" "I'm interested. Let's talk details." We spent the next hour discussing the project. It felt good to be working with the HOA instead of fighting against them. The new board understood that communities are built on cooperation and respect, not power grabs and hidden agendas. The following winter, the Pine Valley Community Trails opened. 20 acres of pristine forest with 5 miles of groomed paths. I designed the layout and handled maintenance. The HOA paid me a fair hourly rate and covered equipment costs. We didn't charge users because the board decided community amenities should be free for residents and their guests. I still maintained my private trails too, but now there was a legitimate alternative that took pressure off my land. People could choose between the official community trails or asking permission to use mine. Most used the community system, which was fine by me. One evening in February, I got a letter forwarded from the county jail. It was from Margaret. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was surprisingly humble. Margaret apologized for everything she'd done. She said prison had given her time to reflect on her choices, and she realized how wrong she'd been. She didn't make excuses or try to justify her actions. She simply said she was sorry and hoped I could forgive her someday. I didn't respond to the letter, but I didn't throw it away either. I filed it with all the other documents from that crazy period. Forgiveness might come eventually, but it wasn't something I was ready for yet. The scars were still too fresh. Spring arrived, then summer. Life in Pine Valley was peaceful. The HOA operated smoothly under Douglas's leadership. Property values had actually increased because word got out about the reforms and the new community amenities. People wanted to live in a place with transparent governance and genuine community spirit. I spent the summer hiking my property, planning improvements for the next winter season. I also started dating someone I'd met at a community event, a woman named Vanessa Pierce, who'd moved to Eagle River to work as a physical therapist. She loved the outdoors as much as I did, and we spent countless hours exploring the Northwoods together. One evening, Vanessa and I were having dinner on my deck when she asked about the trail's situation. I'd told her bits and pieces, but never the full story. So they really just took your property and started charging people to use it? Yep. Put up signs, collection boxes, everything. Like they own the place. That's insane. How did they think they'd get away with it? I think they got drunk on power. Margaret had run the HOA for years without anyone questioning her. She probably thought she could do whatever she wanted. Vanessa shook her head. I'm glad you fought back. A lot of people would have just given up or moved away. I thought about it. But this is my home. I wasn't going to let them drive me out. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how different my life was compared to a year ago. Back then, I'd been fighting a lonely battle against what felt like overwhelming odds. Now I was surrounded by friends in a healthy community, with someone special in my life. The fight had been worth it. The next winter season was perfect. My trails and the community trails both got heavy use. I organized a winter sports day in January with races, demonstrations, and a potluck dinner. Over 200 people showed up. It was exactly the kind of community event Margaret had claimed to want, but achieved through cooperation instead of theft. Douglas came up to me at the potluck. Sam, I've been thinking. We should recognize you somehow for everything you did. If you hadn't stood up to Margaret, who knows how much worse things could have gotten. I don't need recognition, Douglas. I just wanted to protect my property. I know, but you did more than that. You saved this community from corrupt leadership. That matters. A few weeks later, the HOA dedicated a plaque at the community trails. It read, Pine Valley Community Trails dedicated to the principle that strong communities are built on transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. There was no mention of my name, which was exactly how I wanted it. Time passed. Margaret, Brenda, and Karen served their sentences. I heard through the grapevine that Brenda moved away after she got out. Karen stayed in the area but kept a low profile. Margaret also moved, somewhere down south, I think. I never saw any of them again. The community continued to thrive. New families moved in, attracted by the trails and the reformed HOA. The board maintained its commitment to transparency and resident engagement. Meetings were well attended, and decisions were made collaboratively. I eventually married Vanessa in a small ceremony on my property, with the forest as our backdrop. We built a life together in Eagle River, both of us loving the quiet beauty of the Northwoods and the strong community we were part of. Sometimes people who were new to Pine Valley would ask about the trail's situation. They'd heard stories but weren't sure what was true. I'd give them the basics. The HOA overstepped, I pushed back, and the community ultimately did the right thing. I didn't dwell on the details or the drama. The past was the past, but I never forgot the lessons I learned. Property rights matter. HOAs need oversight and accountability. Communities are only as strong as their commitment to fairness. And sometimes, fighting back against injustice is hard and lonely, but absolutely necessary. Standing up to Margaret and her corrupt board was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the stress felt overwhelming, when giving up seemed easier. But I didn't give up, and that made all the difference. My 40 acres remained my sanctuary. The trails I built became part of my legacy in Pine Valley. People skied and snowshoed through those woods, making memories with their families, finding peace in nature, staying healthy and active during the long Wisconsin winters. That was always what I wanted. Not profit, not recognition, just the simple joy of creating something meaningful and sharing it with others on my own terms. The collection boxes and HOA signs were long gone, replaced by hand-carved wooden trail markers I'd made myself. The paths were maintained by me and a few volunteer neighbors who appreciated having access. It was informal and friendly, the way communities should work. Years later, I still loved my winter mornings, grooming the trails as the sun came up over the pines. The rhythmic sound of the equipment, the crisp air, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. It never got old, and every time I saw someone enjoying those trails, I remembered what I'd learned through that difficult year. Your property is worth protecting. Your rights are worth defending. And communities are worth fighting for, especially when they've lost their way. Sometimes one person standing up for what's right can change everything. That's what happened in Pine Valley, and I'd like to think it made us all stronger in the end.